Strike her name from the family registry, Duke Alistair Beaumont commanded, his voice a shard of ice in the cavernous silence of his study. Outside, a relentless autumn rain lashed against the leaded glass, each drop a tiny hammer against the fragile peace of Blackwood Manor. The registrar, a man whose spine seemed to have been replaced by a rod of iron, did not flinch. He simply dipped his quill, the scratch of nib on parchment a sound of finality, an act of erasure. Eleanor, Duchess of Blackwood, was being unwritten. In that moment, Alistair felt nothing but the cold, satisfying burn of righteous fury. He had been betrayed, his honor stained, his trust shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The image was seared behind his eyes. Eleanor, his wife, her hand held by that insipid painter in the West Gallery, her head tilted in a way that spoke of an intimacy he had never been granted. His cousin, Julian, had been right all along. He had warned him of her quiet manipulations, her hidden depths. Alistair had dismissed it as jealousy, but the proof was undeniable. He had seen it. He had cast her out that very afternoon, her pleas for explanation dissolving into the rain-soaked air as the carriage door slammed shut. Now he was severing the final tie, excising her from the Beaumont lineage as a surgeon would a festering wound. He did not know, could not possibly imagine, that hundreds of miles to the north, in a damp stone church smelling of sea salt and old wood, another book already held a truth he could not strike. A parish registry, its pages warped by coastal humidity, contained a fresh entry in spidery ink. Thomas Smith, son of Ellen Smith, father unknown. The unknown father's son, the heir Alistair so desperately craved, had been born 3 weeks prior, his cries swallowed by the roar of the North Sea, and his most defining feature, the one that would one day be Alistair's undoing, was a pair of eyes the exact shade of a gathering storm. The very same eyes that now stared, cold and resolute, out of the Duke's own reflection in the rain-streaked window. 5 years passed. The name Eleanor was never spoken at Blackwood Manor. It became a ghost, a void around which life carefully navigated. Alistair had remarried within the year, a strategic alliance with Lady Beatrice, a woman whose lineage was as impeccable as her conversation was dull. The union was a barren one, in every sense of the word. The great house, once merely quiet, became a tomb. The silence was a physical weight, pressing down on the velvet curtains and polished mahogany. Alistair moved through his days with the clockwork precision of a man hollowed out. He managed his estates, sat in the House of Lords, and hosted dinners where the clinking of silver was the loudest sound in the room. But at night, in the dark, the ghost of Eleanor would return. He would remember not the supposed betrayal, but the scent of lavender that clung to her hair, the way she would bite her lip when lost in a book, the quiet strength in her gaze that he had mistaken for indifference. He had called it indifference, but Julian had called it cunning. Alistair had believed Julian. The rot began to show in small ways. A careless word from a drunken footman about a purse of gold changing hands on the night of the incident. The sudden, inexplicable prosperity of the maid who had provided the most damning testimony, now married and living far beyond her former station. These were whispers, inconsistencies that Alistair, in his initial rage, had been blind to. Now, in the suffocating emptiness of his life, they were like stones in his shoe, impossible to ignore. His cousin Julian remained a constant presence, his counsel ever present, his sympathy a cloying perfume. He managed Alistair's finances, vetted his staff, and subtly steered his social engagements. Alistair had once seen it as loyalty. Now a sliver of suspicion began to work its way under his skin. It was a slow, creeping dread, the dawning horror that the foundation of his life was built not on rock, but on a carefully constructed lie. The final crack appeared on a Tuesday. Alistair was reviewing estate ledgers when he found a discrepancy, a significant sum paid to a London art dealer, authorized by Julian, for a collection of paintings that had never arrived. When he confronted his cousin, Julian's composure, for the first time in memory, fractured. His denial was too quick, his eyes darting away. In that flicker of guilt, Alistair saw the truth. The betrayal had not been Eleanor's. It had been his. He did not rage this time. The fury was gone, replaced by an icy, soul-deep sickness. He hired investigators, discreet men from London who moved through the world like shadows. He gave them 2 tasks: uncover every facet of Julian's life and find Eleanor. The first was shockingly easy. Julian was a man drowning in gambling debts, a creature of resentment who had coveted the Blackwood title his entire life. The bribes, the lies, the carefully orchestrated scene in the gallery, it all unspooled in a sordid, pathetic tale of greed. The second task proved far more difficult. Eleanor had vanished as if she had never existed. The Duchess of Blackwood had stepped into a carriage and disappeared from the face of the earth. For months the search yielded nothing. Alistair fell into a state of quiet despair. The manor became his prison, each portrait-lined hallway a testament to his monumental failure. He had destroyed the one good thing in his life, based on the word of a viper. He had not just been a fool, he had been a willing one. Then a breakthrough. An investigator, a tenacious former Bow Street runner named Graves, traced a retired lady's maid, Agnes, to a small cottage in the Cotswolds. The woman was fiercely loyal, but Graves was patient. He spoke not of the Duke's orders, but of a man's regret. He spoke of truth. Finally, Agnes relented, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and contempt for the Duke she had once served. She told them of a desperate flight north, of a woman determined to protect her unborn child. She gave them a destination, a small, wind-battered fishing village on the Yorkshire coast named Port Blossom, a place where a duchess could become a ghost. Alistair traveled north alone. He left his ducal carriage and his livery behind, taking a public coach for the final leg of the journey. The landscape changed, softening from manicured estates to rugged, windswept moors. The air grew sharp with the sting of salt. Port Blossom was a cluster of stone cottages clinging to a cliffside, huddled against the relentless wind from the North Sea. The smell was of fish and coal smoke and damp earth. It was a world away from the manicured gardens and perfumed halls of Blackwood. It felt more real, more honest. He found her cottage at the edge of the village, a small, whitewashed dwelling with a slate roof and a garden where hardy cabbages grew. He stood for a long time, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. What would he say? How could any words bridge the chasm of 5 years of hardship he had inflicted upon her? He saw her before she saw him. She was coming up the path from the shore, a heavy basket of mended nets slung over her shoulder. This was not the woman he remembered. The Duchess Eleanor had been willowy, her skin like porcelain, her hands soft and unblemished. This woman was weathered by the sun and wind, her body lean and strong from labor. Her hands, when she shifted the basket, were chapped and calloused. There was an iron resilience in her posture that had never been there before. But it was her. The proud set of her jaw, the deep auburn of her hair, now braided simply down her back. She was more beautiful than he had ever remembered. Then he saw the boy, a small child of about 4 or 5, with a tangle of dark hair, ran out of the cottage to meet her. He was chattering excitedly, pointing to a shell he held in his hand. Eleanor's face, which had been set in a mask of weary determination, softened into a smile of such profound love that it stole the breath from Alistair's lungs. The boy looked up, his smile faltering as he saw the tall stranger standing by the gate. And Alistair felt the world tilt on its axis. The boy had his eyes, not a vague resemblance, not a trick of the light. They were the Beaumont eyes, a distinct, stormy gray that had been passed down for generations. They were the eyes Alistair saw in his own mirror every morning. This was his son. The realization was not a thought, but a physical blow. It knocked the air from his body and buckled his knees. All the pain, the regret, the self-loathing of the past years coalesced into this single, devastating moment. He had not just cast out his wife, he had abandoned his child. Eleanor followed the boy's gaze. Her eyes met Alistair's across the short distance. Her smile vanished, replaced by a look of such frigid shock that it was more terrifying than any rage. The basket of nets slipped from her shoulder, landing with a soft thud on the dirt path. She moved swiftly, pulling the boy behind her, her body a shield. Her voice, when she spoke, was as sharp and cold as the sea wind. "What are you doing here?" It was not a question. It was a demand, an accusation. The title was gone. He was not your grace. He was a trespasser, an enemy. "Eleanor," he breathed, his own voice sounding foreign and weak. I know everything." A bitter, humorless laugh escaped her lips. "You know everything? You knew everything 5 years ago, did you not? You knew I was a faithless whore. You knew I had dishonored your precious name. You made your judgment quite clear." "I was wrong," he said, the words feeling utterly inadequate, pathetic. "I was deceived by Julian." He took a step forward, his hands open in a gesture of supplication. "He lied. It was all a lie." She did not move. Her eyes, so like their son's, were hard as flint. "A lie?" she repeated, her voice dripping with scorn. "And it took you 5 years to discover this lie? 5 years while I scrubbed floors and mended nets to feed your son? Your convenient revelation changes nothing." "Our son," he corrected, his gaze fixed on the small boy peering around his mother's skirts. "His name?" "His name is Thomas," she said, her chin lifting in defiance. "And he is my son. You forfeited any claim to him the day you threw his mother out into the street." The boy, Thomas, chose that moment to speak. His voice was small but clear. "Mama, who is that man?" Eleanor's expression flickered with pain. "He is no one, my love, a man who is lost." "I am not lost," Alistair said, his voice cracking with an emotion he could no longer contain. "I have been, but I am not now. I came to find you both." He looked from Eleanor's unforgiving face to the curious, innocent one of his son. The chasm between his past actions and his present desires seemed impossibly wide. He could see his entire life bifurcated into 2 distinct paths: the hollow, gilded existence he had been living, and the raw, difficult but meaningful life she had built here without him. "Please," he whispered, the word a prayer. "Let me explain." "There is nothing to explain," she countered, her voice low and fierce. "You had your chance to listen 5 years ago. You chose to believe a lie because it was easier. It confirmed your every suspicion about the quiet woman you married, but never bothered to know. Your pride was more important than my word, more important than our marriage." She gathered Thomas into her arms, his small body a warm, living shield against the man who was his father. "Go back to your life, Your Grace. You are not wanted here." She turned and walked into the cottage, the door closing behind her with a definitive click. It was a sound of dismissal as absolute as the slam of the carriage door 5 years ago. Alistair stood alone in the encroaching twilight, the sea wind whipping at his coat, the smell of salt and wood smoke filling his senses. He had found them, and he had lost them all over again. He did not leave. To return to Blackwood, to the echoing silence and the suffocating velvet, was unthinkable. That life was a fiction. This raw and painful reality on a forgotten stretch of coast, was the only thing that was real. He walked into the village, a man adrift, and found the only inn, the Fisherman's Rest. It was a humble, noisy place, smelling of stale ale and fried fish. The Duke of Blackwood, a man who slept in silk sheets and commanded an army of servants, took a small, drafty room overlooking the harbor. The irony was not lost on him. He had cast his wife out, and now he was the exile. The innkeeper, a burly man with a suspicious eye, recognized the quality of his coat and the weight of the coins he used to pay, and treated him with a wary distance. News traveled fast in a place like Port Blossom. By morning, the entire village knew a lord was staying at the inn, and they all knew whose cottage he had been standing outside of for an hour. For a week, he kept his distance. He watched from afar as Eleanor went about her life. He saw her carry water from the village well, her shoulders straight under the weight of the yoke. He saw her haggling for fish at the docks, her voice sharp and clear, respected by the hardened fishermen. He saw her teaching Thomas how to write his letters, the two of them huddled by the fire, their heads close together in the warm glow of the cottage window. Each scene was a fresh torment, a glimpse into the life he had thrown away. He saw the community she had built, the fishermen's wives who stopped to chat with her, the children who played with Thomas, the shopkeeper who saved the best cuts of bacon for her. She was not a pariah here. She was Ellen Smith, a hard-working widow, a respected member of their small world. He was the outsider. He understood that words were useless. His apology was meaningless without action. He had to dismantle the lie, not just for her, but for himself, for his son. He sent a writer to London with 2 letters. The first was to his solicitor, instructing him to begin proceedings for an annulment from Beatrice on grounds of her own well-documented infidelities Julian had conveniently helped conceal. The second letter was to Graves, his investigator, summoning him to Port Blossom. He was to bring every piece of evidence he had gathered against Julian: the signed confession from the dying artist, the ledger showing the bribes, the testimony from the maid. He needed an arsenal of truth. While he waited, he made a decision. His presence here was a disruption. He needed to be part of the village, not an object of gawking curiosity. He approached the innkeeper and made an offer that left the man speechless. He bought the fisherman's rest. He paid a sum so extravagant that the innkeeper could retire to a warm climate and live out his days in comfort. Alistair Beaumont, Duke of Blackwood, became a publican. He learned to pull pints of ale, to mop the floors sticky with spilled drink, to listen to the fishermen's complaints about the weather and the poor catch. It was humbling, back-breaking work. His hands, once soft, began to blister and then to harden. He was clumsy at first, an object of amusement for the locals, this strange, sad-eyed gentleman playing at being a commoner. But he was persistent. He never complained. He simply worked, and he watched. He watched for a chance, any small chance, to prove he was not the man he had been. Eleanor, of course, heard about his bizarre transformation immediately. She watched him from her cottage window, her heart a confusing knot of anger, disbelief, and a tiny, treacherous flicker of something else. It was absurd. A duke serving ale to fishermen. It had to be a ploy, a grand, manipulative gesture designed to win her back. She hardened her heart against it. She refused to speak to him, turning her back if she saw him in the village street. But Thomas was a child. He was curious. He saw the tall, quiet man who now ran the inn, the man with eyes just like his own. He would ask questions she could not answer. "Why is that man sad, Mama? Why does he always look at us?" Graves arrived a fortnight later, a leather satchel full of documents under his arm. Alistair took the satchel and walked the familiar path to Eleanor's cottage. It was evening. He could see her inside, sitting by the fire, mending one of Thomas's small shirts. He knocked on the door. He heard her tell Thomas to stay put, her footsteps firm as she approached. She opened the door just a crack, her body blocking the entrance. "I told you to leave." "I am not asking for your forgiveness," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I am not asking for anything. I'm only asking you to look at this." He held out the leather satchel. "It is the truth, all of it. The proof of what Julian did. The artist's confession. The bank records. Everything." She stared at the satchel, then at his face. She saw the exhaustion etched around his eyes, the new calluses on his hands. She saw not a duke demanding entrance, but a man bearing a burden. After a long moment, she slowly opened the door and took the bag from his hand. She didn't invite him in. She simply closed the door in his face once more. Alistair walked back to the inn, a fragile tendril of hope warring with the familiar weight of despair. He had laid the truth at her feet. The rest was up to her. That night, by the light of a single candle, Eleanor unspooled the sordid tale of her own ruin. She read the artist's shaky, deathbed script, describing Julian's threats and the bag of coins that had bought his complicity. She saw the ledgers, the flow of money from Alistair's accounts, siphoned by Julian to pay gambling debts, a small portion diverted to the maid who had sworn she saw an illicit kiss. It was all there, a cold, meticulous conspiracy, born of greed and jealousy. She had always known she was innocent, but seeing the architecture of the lie laid bare was a different kind of pain. It was a validation wrapped in agony. Alistair had not been cruel out of malice, but out of a profound, arrogant blindness. He had been a puppet, and Julian the master. It didn't excuse him. It didn't erase the 5 years of hardship, the lonely nights, the fear of raising a child alone with nothing. But it changed the narrative. Her enemy had not been her husband, but the man he had trusted above all others. She did not go to him the next day, or the day after. She needed to process this new reality. She watched him. She saw him rise before dawn to light the inn's fires. She saw him share his own meal with a beggar who wandered into town. She saw him listen with genuine interest, as an old fisherman recounted a long-winded story. He was not playing a role. He was living it. He was performing a quiet, relentless penance. The turning point came during a storm. A fierce gale blew in from the sea, driving torrential rain before it. The village weir, old and poorly maintained, began to groan under the pressure. If it broke, the lower cottages, including Eleanor's, would be flooded. The men of the village worked frantically in the driving rain, piling sandbags, trying to shore up the weakened stone. It was a losing battle. Then Alistair appeared. He was not dressed as an innkeeper or a duke, but as a laborer, stripped to his shirt sleeves in the deluge. He did not give orders. He listened to the fishermen, to their knowledge of the tides and the weir's weaknesses. Then he applied an engineer's logic, something he had studied in his youth but never used. He organized the men, directing them to brace the weakest points, using leverage and sound principles to distribute the pressure. He worked alongside them, hauling waterlogged timbers and heavy stones, his muscles straining, mud and rain plastering his hair to his face. He worked until his body shook with exhaustion, and they held the weir. As dawn broke, the storm passed, and the village was safe. Eleanor had watched the entire thing from her window, her heart pounding. She had seen a leader, not of men, but among them. She had seen the man he could have been, the man he was perhaps becoming. That afternoon, she walked to the inn. It was quiet, the usual patrons exhausted from the night's work. Alistair was behind the bar, wiping it down with a rag, his movements slow and stiff. He looked up as she entered, and a flicker of surprise and something like hope crossed his face. She placed the leather satchel on the bar. "I read it," she said, her voice quiet. He simply nodded, waiting. "I believe you," she said. The words hung in the air between them. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. It was a simple statement of fact, a foundation stone laid on barren ground. But it changes little. The past 5 years happened. Thomas, he knows nothing but this life, nothing of you. "I know," he said. "I do not expect to be a father to him overnight, or ever, perhaps, but I would like to know him, if you would allow it, as Mr. Beaumont, the innkeeper." Eleanor considered this. It was a humble request. It was a dangerous one, but she looked at this changed man, at the quiet dignity in his exhaustion, and she found she could not refuse. "He is curious about you," she admitted. You may walk with us on the beach tomorrow, if the weather holds." It was a small beginning. The walks on the beach were awkward at first. Thomas was shy, hiding behind his mother's skirts. Alistair did not press. He spoke of shells and seabirds. He answered the boy's questions simply and honestly. He never once mentioned Blackwood or his title. He was just the sad man from the inn. Slowly, cautiously, the boy began to trust him. He started showing Alistair his favorite tide pools, chattering about the crabs and starfish he found. Alistair, in turn, found himself captivated by this small, bright person who was his son. He discovered the boy had a quick, inquisitive mind and a deep well of kindness. He was Eleanor's son in spirit, but he had Alistair's face. Each time Thomas smiled at him, it was both a joy and a fresh stab of guilt. One afternoon, Alistair traveled to the next town on an errand. He found himself standing outside the parish church. On an impulse, he went inside. He found the vicar and asked to see the registry book for Port Blossom, claiming a genealogical interest. The old vicar, happy for the company, obliged. Alistair turned the pages, his hands unsteady. And there it was, his breath caught in his throat. Thomas Smith, son of Ellen Smith, father unknown. The ink seemed to mock him. He thought of his own command, spoken with such cold authority in his grand study. Strike her name from the family registry. He had tried to erase her, to declare her non-existent in the annals of his noble family, and all the while, the simple, undeniable truth of his son's existence was recorded here, in this humble parish book. His legacy was not in the gilded volume at Blackwood, but here, under the heading, Father Unknown. He was the unknown father, a ghost, a failure. He closed the book, the weight of his sins pressing down on him. Atonement was not a single act, he realized. It was a life. He returned to Port Blossom with a renewed, quieter determination. He continued his small acts of service, not just for Eleanor, but for the village that had become her sanctuary. He used his immense wealth, channeled discreetly through his solicitors, to fund a new schoolhouse. He established a fund for the widows of fishermen lost at sea. He did not seek credit. Most of the villagers never knew where the money came from, but Eleanor knew. She saw his hand in the subtle improvements, in the easing of the burdens of her neighbors. He was not trying to buy her. He was trying to heal the world he had broken. The final confrontation with Julian was not dramatic. Alistair had him summoned to his solicitor's office in London. He did not attend himself. He had his solicitor, armed with the mountain of evidence, lay out the terms. Julian would be stripped of his titles, his allowance, and his inheritance. He would be socially and financially ruined. If he ever attempted to contact any member of the Beaumont family again, the evidence would be turned over to the authorities. Julian, cornered and exposed, fled to the continent, a disgraced man with nothing but the clothes on his back. The annulment from Beatrice was granted swiftly and quietly. The chapter was closed. Alistair was free. He returned to Port Blossom, but he did not tell Eleanor what he had done. He simply continued his life as an innkeeper. The change in their relationship was gradual, almost imperceptible. The silences between them became less tense, filled with a shared understanding rather than unspoken accusations. She began to bring him a warm meal in the evenings, knowing he often worked too late to cook for himself. He began to repair things around her cottage, a loose shutter, a leaky roof, without being asked. They were not courting. They were two people cautiously, painstakingly rebuilding a bridge over a chasm. The moment of true vulnerability came unexpectedly. Thomas was playing near the docks, slipped on a wet stone, and fell, gashing his knee badly. He was frightened, his cries sharp with pain. Alistair was there in an instant, scooping the boy into his arms. He carried him not to Eleanor's cottage, but into the inn. He laid him on a table, and, with a gentleness that stunned Eleanor, who had followed in a panic, he cleaned the wound. His hands, though calloused and rough, were incredibly tender. He spoke to Thomas in a low, soothing voice, distracting him with a story about a brave crab who fought a seagull. By the time he was done bandaging the knee, Thomas's tears had subsided, and he was looking at Alistair with wide, trusting eyes. He had run to Alistair. In his moment of pain and fear, he had sought out his father. Eleanor watched the scene, and the last of the ice around her heart finally cracked and melted away. She saw not the Duke of Blackwood, or the arrogant man who had condemned her, or the penitent innkeeper. She saw a father caring for his son. She saw her family. Later that night, after Thomas was asleep, she walked over to the inn. Alistair was sitting alone in the common room, staring into the fire. "He asked for you," she said softly, "after you left. He wanted to know when Mr. Beaumont was coming back." Alistair looked up, his face etched with a painful, hopeful longing. "Eleanor," she stopped him. "I have seen who you are, Alistair, not who you were. I have seen you humble yourself. I have seen you work and care and build. You have earned your place here." She took a deep breath. "And perhaps you have earned a second chance." The words were quiet, but they landed with the force of a thunderclap. Forgiveness. It was not a grand declaration, but a simple, terrifying, beautiful offering. He stood up and walked towards her, his movements slow, as if he were afraid she might bolt. He stopped a few feet away, his stormy gray eyes searching hers. "I don't deserve it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of it, of you, of him." "I know," she said. They did not return to Blackwood immediately. They were married in the small stone church in Port Blossom, the same church where their son had been christened. The witnesses were the fishermen and their wives, the community that had embraced Eleanor in her darkest hour. It was a simple ceremony, devoid of pomp and circumstance. It was real. For their son, they decided he should know his heritage, but not be defined by it. They would raise him between two worlds, the rugged honesty of Port Blossom and the responsibility of Blackwood. When they finally did return to the manor, it was a different place because they were different people. Eleanor was no longer a decorative duchess, but a true partner. She took charge of the household with a pragmatism and efficiency that stunned the staff. She rooted out the stuffy, oppressive traditions, filling the house with light and air. The funereal lilies were banished, replaced with wildflowers Thomas picked from the meadows. Alistair, for his part, managed the estates with a newfound sense of duty, not to his name, but to the people who worked the land. He established fair wages, built new housing for his tenants, and used his influence in Parliament to advocate for the poor. They were a team, their marriage a partnership built on a foundation of hard-won truth and mutual respect. The final, symbolic peace came on a cold winter's evening. A fire roared in the grand library, the same room where Alistair had once conducted his sterile, lonely life. But now, the room was filled with warmth and sound. Alistair was on the floor, on his hands and knees, pretending to be a horse for a giggling 5-year-old Thomas. Eleanor sat in a comfortable chair, not with a book of poetry, but with estate ledgers, a small smile playing on her lips as she watched her husband and son. The oppressive silence of the manor was gone forever, replaced by the joyful shouts of a child and the quiet contentment of a family that had been broken, lost, and finally, miraculously, found. The past was not forgotten. Its scars were a part of them, but it no longer had the power to harm. They had unwritten their tragedy and, together, had authored a new story, one of love, atonement, and the enduring strength of a bond that could not be struck from any registry.